Welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Mercurio-Sakwa. I'm the CEO at Emerge Center Against Domestic Abuse. Nearly 6,000 victims of domestic violence and their children come to Emerge every year seeking services. There's over 15,000 calls to 911 in our community every year for domestic violence alone. And in the last 18 months, as Pima County has rolled out a new risk assessment prioritization protocol, we have identified through an evidence-based assessment thousands of domestic violence victims who are at high risk for serious injury or death. And about 2,000 have reached out and accessed support services that they would have never received otherwise. The sheer volume of what we're talking about here should be enough to give us as a community great pause in thinking about what we are doing or not doing to address this issue of domestic violence. But it's also an opportunity to be grateful for the fact that in Pima County, we have truly unique and cutting-edge leadership around this issue in terms of our county attorney's office, our Tucson City Court Domestic Violence Court, our law enforcement and first responders, service providers across the spectrum, many of whom are all represented here today, who all work as a system to make sure that we are doing our very best to meet the needs of domestic violence survivors in our community. But as we embark on Domestic Violence Awareness Month here in October, far more important than any of those numbers or protocols, or certainly anybody who's standing up here, are the human beings behind those statistics. They are not nameless and faceless. They're our family, our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers, the people, our community. And as a community, we've got an important role to play in addressing this issue of domestic violence, because this is not, contrary to popular belief, a private matter. It's a public health and a public safety crisis that we're dealing with in our community. And so as we enter this month, yes, we need to raise awareness. But awareness in and of itself is woefully inadequate to address this issue. What we need to do is start talking about this issue in a really meaningful way. We need to start sharing the resources and the ways in which we can help the victims and survivors who are dealing with this today, and also to acknowledge the socialization that underlies this problem, but also guides us in terms of what we as a community need to do differently in order to stop more hurting from harm. We've got to change how we treat each other, what we laugh at, what we stay silent about, what we accept and tolerate as unchangeable, what we teach our children about gender and relationships, and about power and control, and what we are willing to do in terms of offering help to both survivors and those who are using abusive behaviors, even when it's awkward, even when we don't know exactly what to say, because we've decided to put other people's safety ahead of our comfort. And we've got to start role modeling something very different for both our kids and each other. And perhaps most importantly, we need to do this year-round, not just in October, but 365 days a year, just like the abuse and violence itself. So with that, I'd like to introduce our county attorney, who's been a great supporter of survivors, Barbara LaWall.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you all. It's really nice to be here. You know, you just heard some pretty astonishing and appalling statistics from Ed. Domestic violence is the most common cause of injury to women and children. And last year there were more than 15,000 reports to law enforcement. I don't know that there's another crime that is so prevalent and so constant. This figure doesn't begin to tell the whole story at all about the kind of violence that's being perpetrated in our community. Significant number of our homicides every year are domestic violence related. And as your county attorney, one of my major concerns is the impact that domestic violence has on our children. because the children who are involved in these relationships carry lingering effects of the violence that they see perpetrated in their homes throughout the rest of their lives. So as your prosecutor, I have really devoted myself to trying to do whatever we can to decrease the amount of violence in domestic abuse issues in our community. So I'm going to take a minute here and tell you a little bit about what my office is doing in collaboration with all of these agencies that are up here. First, we work very closely with law enforcement to ensure that all these cases are appropriately investigated so that they enhance the preservation of evidence that we need in order to prosecute. We work vigorously, aggressively, and in a timely manner to prosecute domestic violence out of my office and to ensure that the offenders themselves are held accountable and that we provide for the safety of the victim. So in order to do that, to address those goals, a few years ago we created, along with the courts, a specialized domestic violence court for Pima County Justice Court, and it significantly enhances our ability to prosecute the offenders. It's a multidisciplinary approach. It involves all of our partners, the consolidated court system, the adult probation, the sheriff's department, my office, victim services, and we all work together to hold offenders accountable for their actions and to provide the highest level of service possible to the victims. What domestic violence court does, it ensures that the violent, serious, and repeat offenders don't slip through the cracks, because each of the cases is first reviewed by one judge, one prosecutor, and one victim advocate. The worst and most violent of these offenders are kept in DV court, and their cases are tried by that assigned judge and prosecutor, and they are specially trained in the complexities of domestic violence cases. We also, out of my office, lead a community-wide domestic violence coalition called the Risk Assessment Management and Prevention, the RAMP Coalition. RAMP includes my office, all the law enforcement agencies in Pima County, the Emerge Center Against Domestic Abuse, the Southern Arizona Legal Aid Society, and SACASA, Tucson Medical Center, and other agencies. And what we do in RAMP is we work together, we identify what improvements are needed, and then we work to seek and obtain federal, state, and other grants in order to make those improvements happen. And I'm just thrilled over the fact that over the past 3 years, we have raised more than $1.2 million for the RAMP project. And what this has done is this has helped us fully implement the appraised lethality risk assessment as well as for forensic strangulation exams. We lead that task force, the Appraised Implementation Task Force, and we participate in the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team. Individuals through all of these different multi-agencies get together, and when there's a domestic violence fatality, they dissect it. They look through it much in the same way as when an airplane goes down, what the board does to assess what happened and how could we prevent it from happening in the future. We all work very hard to ensure that victims and their children are afforded very specialized crisis services in our victim witness program. We coordinate the follow-up services that are necessary, and the organizations are put together to enhance victim safety. We also hold offenders accountable. That is probably one of the most important things that happens out of my office. And when appropriate, we provide them with rehabilitation services and treatment. We collaborate with other agencies such as Jewish Family and Children's Services, definitely with Emerge and other social service agencies in the community to provide very specialized services for children and their families who are exposed to domestic violence, physical abuse, and community violence. My office also provides leadership and infrastructure for a new, very broad-reaching, multi-agency domestic violence task force, which has just recently been created, called the Justice League Task Force. And it was created to identify areas of needed improvement. Because although over the 40-some-odd years that I've been in the prosecutor's office, we've come a light years ahead of where we were back in 1976 with regards to the steps that we've taken to improve domestic violence. There's always improvement that's needed. There's always something that can be bettered, that can be improved upon, and that can be highlighted and identified to hold offenders more accountable and also to better support our victims. There's a lot that we do, there's a lot more that we can do, but we will never be able, ever, to arrest and prosecute our way out of domestic violence. To echo what Ed said just a moment ago, it's going to take a community. It takes an entire village. It takes people to change their mindset, to change their ways, to be able to educate, to inform, and to prevent. And when domestic violence is looked upon from the medical, the social, the economic, and the criminal justice perspective, it's clear that it affects every one of those fields. Our safety, our personal health, our healthcare system, and our criminal justice system are at risk when we have as much violence in our community as we currently do. This month, I asked our entire community to stop and to pause for a moment and to reflect and think about what we could do as a community if we could just raise one generation of children without violence. Just think about it. Just one generation. Think of the possibilities. Thank you, and I now turn this over to the Chairman of the Board of Supervisors, Richard Elias.
Thank you, and appreciate your words, Barbara. Special thanks to all the folks up here standing with us for all your work, for your dedication, especially to the advocates who work for Emerge, Ed, and your staff. Ultimately, you show a lot of love for our community, and it's a very difficult issue, but we do so, and you do so, with such dignity that it helps take a little small bit of that pain away. So, this is a public health issue. It's a criminal issue, no doubt, but it is a public health issue. And the way to attack public health issues in the long run, I believe, as our county attorney said, is ultimately through education and educating the public about what this looks like, about what this is. So, talking to our own children is where it starts. Talking to our family, talking to our grandchildren, talking to those of us who are lucky enough to know young people who would listen to us. Doesn't always happen. But take that time to model. Take that time to educate. Take that time to talk. Take that time to tell the story. To tell the story. My own mother suffered tremendously from domestic abuse that was rampant in her household when she was a child. While I'm very proud of my family, that's a part of my family's history that not everyone talks about, but I do, because I believe it needs to be said, and it needs to be said out loud, and it needs to be said in the name of Viola, my mother, who suffered tremendously her whole life, because her journey was a difficult one. So that story needs to be told. The next thing follows right along, and that's specifically working with people who are survivors on their journey back from that pain, from that difficult situation, from that lack of love that they feel, and from the trauma they've experienced in their lives. And then there's also accountability, and holding people accountable for their actions, and helping them to understand that we have to bear the responsibility of our actions. And then when we say something stupid, we also need to bear the accountability of that as well. And that means stepping up to the plate and letting somebody know sometimes, because that's hard to do as well. But that's what we're called to do every day. And then there's one last thing I think that's important on this journey of education. And that's remembering those who did not survive and standing up for them and caring for them and recognizing that their journey is passed to another side. So as a part of that, I'm going to ask everybody to recognize a moment of silence in honor of those folks in Tucson who did not survive. Thank you all for being here today.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. Each year when we get together for this event, I'm incredibly impressed by the law enforcement from across the region that comes together. And what that's a reflection of is work that's going on all year amongst the jurisdictions, but also the widespread abuse that occurs in this community. Every jurisdiction is affected at all different levels. October is the month we come together to call attention to the problem of domestic abuse, but the fact of the matter is this is something that we need to pay attention to every day of the year. On Thursday, October 24th, the day nationally recognized is the day to paint Pima purple. On the 24th, we've got our purple on today, and I'm sure some will wear it all month long. Domestic abuse is persistent and pervasive, and it is complicated, and every story is different, but if there is a common theme, it's that its roots lie in entitlement. The belief that we're somehow entitled to the services, the obedience, and the affections of another. And that belief is simply erroneous, and it's a belief that can lead to twisted and violent interactions between humans that probably at one time did love one another. We don't have the right to control other people, and they don't have the right to control us. But whenever that boundary is crossed, whenever one adult believes they have the right to control another, abuse will occur. Unfortunately, and as proven by the widespread people that are here today, there's no demographic, no socioeconomic status that's immune to domestic abuse. And that's what makes it so hard to prevent. But once it starts, the pattern is easy to recognize. The time to take action is early on, before that abuse escalates, possibly into life-threatening violence. And that is what, as a group, law enforcement in this community has recognized. That it's groups like Emerge and groups like Jewish Family and Children's Services, that if we can get to people early enough and get them to have the courage to stand up, and that often takes the support of those around them, that we can do something to curb this problem. Our police department takes domestic abuse very seriously, as do our prosecutors. Emerge is an important partner in getting victims to safety and providing them the emotional support to rebuild their lives. I would just like to personally thank Emerge CEO, Mercurio-Sakwa. I think he's the one who gets us all together every year, but I know Tucson Police Chief Magnus, the Sheriff Mark Napier, the prosecutor LaWall, our city prosecutor Alan Merritt, and all the staffs and organizations that are here lead the way for the work that's done. I do need to point out that our chief of police of the UA Police Department, Ron Seastone's here. Don't forget that this happens everywhere, in all ages, and it's important that everyone is here. So I'm just very grateful that we have a community that cares, that puts so much effort in this to make our city safer. And I want to thank each of you. And with that, I would bring up Chief Magnus.
So as I bring things up at the end here, I would also like to thank our incredible partners. I have to start with an appreciation for the men and women on the front lines of policing. I know I speak for the sheriff when I say we recognize that there are few more difficult jobs than responding to calls that involve domestic violence. And I appreciate the fact that we are doing so much more on these calls than police were ever expected to do in the past. And that's good, that's important, but it is definitely not easy. So I appreciate them, as I also appreciate our very capable investigators who follow up on these cases, often with victims that are still in trauma, that are not always willing or ready to prosecute, that carry a heavy burden, and so providing them with service is challenging, but very important work. We're very fortunate to have the partners that we do from Emerge, from the County Attorney's Office, really from such a network of other partners. This is a community of many partners when it comes to domestic violence, and I appreciate living and working here in Tucson, where we have so many great nonprofit organizations, involvement from businesses, the faith community, many more folks who've gotten involved in dealing with this issue, and that is, I don't think we could make the progress that we've made without that kind of support. But I just have to echo one other thing that you've already heard a couple of times, because this is a theme that is so important. Domestic violence really is a crime. It's a dynamic that happens everywhere throughout our social fabric. It happens in homes, it happens in apartments, it happens in homeless encampments. And it happens even in the workplace sometimes. There's no regard to socioeconomic status. This isn't something that goes with a particular zip code. There is no particular racial or ethnic status or faith background, sexual orientation, any other classification. Sadly, it makes no difference. It cuts across all of those lines, which is why the points that have been made so eloquently about the need for education, but maybe even above and beyond that, before you can even have education, you have to have conversation. And the willingness to talk about this, even with children at a very young age, and then throughout people's lives to have these conversations, is just incredibly important. We are very fortunate to be able to work with this particular coalition that has been so innovation focused. We've been able, as you heard, to introduce this appraised lethality assessment and implement that county-wide. You can't imagine what a tremendous burden this has placed on the team at Emerge to follow up with individuals who are at high risk for a lethal encounter, and their willingness to take that on, the ability of others to help with grant funding to support that has been critically important. And a lot of folks do not realize that the use of assessments such as appraise is not a nationwide dynamic. This is not like, oh, you're just doing what everybody else is doing. This is something that's being done in very few jurisdictions, and it's really critically important. And we believe, even though evaluation of this particular tool is still underway, we can see indications already that it's making a difference in saving lives. We also really have to recognize the value of grants in helping us do this work. Grants from both private sector foundations and the public sector. We recently have been fortunate to get several federal grants from the Office of Violence Against Women. This is part of the Federal Department of Justice. And this federal partnership has been key for us. For example, in the Tucson Police Department, it has allowed us to have 2 Spanish-speaking detectives because, of course, as I said, this crosses all lines, and the importance of being able to speak Spanish in a community, especially like ours, is critical to serve victims and to then ultimately be able to hold perpetrators accountable. We've also appreciate the work and support that we've gotten from the Mexican consulate here in Tucson, as well as groups like the YWCA's La Promotora program to help increase our ability to reach a very diverse group of victims who need services, so we could really do the kind of investigation and follow-up that's necessary. So look, the bottom line is this. Addressing domestic violence, geez, I feel like I've been part of these gatherings and press conferences, dare I say, for, I don't even tell you how many decades, you know, even as a police chief, I've been attending these. And it's always and continues to be a massive challenge. But the kind of partnerships and collaboration that we have in this community really is special. And it takes a special collaboration to confront a problem as complex and persistent as domestic violence. So I am optimistic. I am optimistic for the future that with the kind of innovation that groups like this are accomplishing, with the kind of dedication, with the kind of experience, with the willingness to innovate and try new things that is represented by the team that surrounds me, we are making a difference for victims of domestic violence in this community. So thank you so much for joining us here today. I think this turnout alone demonstrates a tremendous commitment to increasing awareness and understanding about domestic violence. And again, thank you all so much for being here.
Well, thank you. I'd just like to echo what my colleagues have said, that some of us who've been in law enforcement a very long time remember when there were no domestic violence laws. And we left women in very dangerous environments to be further subjected to abuse when it was seen as a simple little family fight, not a very important thing. Some of us remember that Ralph Cramden used to double up his fist and threaten to send Alice to the moon, and we laughed about that. That's not funny. The crime of domestic violence is not something to be taken lightly. And I'm so pleased that this community, the law enforcement community, our community partners, and all of us are taking this crime much more seriously, because it does touch every racial, economic, social background in our community. And then it touches every facet of our community, the public health system, the criminal justice system, the mental health system. And what is just tragic about this is that we know that young people, when exposed to domestic violence in their home, are much more likely as adults to act out in domestic violence situations. So this is a generational thing as well. But we've come together and we've got great resources. I'm so proud of what our county attorney's doing to take this crime very seriously and apply resources to it. And then look at all the community partners that we have behind me. We could not ask for a better partner than Emerge and the great work that's being going on there. So as your county sheriff, I'm just so pleased that this is a great body that is now taking a crime that is a crime very seriously. This is not a simple spat. It drains law enforcement resources. One of the most frequent calls that we're called to, and also one of the most dangerous for law enforcement officers to face. But we are blessed here in Pima County to have great community partners, great law enforcement partners, that we all collaborate, cooperate as we should to take on this very serious issue. So I'm just so proud of all the people behind me. I'm just honored to be a part of this and to see the evolution of this come from when there were no domestic violence statutes and when it was funding to send Alice to the moon, to where we're really taking this seriously and realize with absolute confidence that domestic violence does not get better. It progressively gets worse. And if we can intervene before there's a tragedy, we can save lives, save our community, and save the strain on many facets of our resource network here in Pima County. So I'm honored to speak to you, I'm honored to be the sheriff, and more than that, I'm humbled by all the people that are behind me, these great community assets that we have. Thank you.
I'll just end by, first of all, thanking the media for attending. It's, as we talked about, all about education and awareness and starting to have community conversation, and we can't do that without getting the word out.